You're listening to The Stark Truth with Robert Stark.
This is Robert Stark. I am joined here with Jay Dyer. He runs Jay's Analysis and has the book out, Esoteric Hollywood. Jay, it's great talking to you.
Hey man, it's good. It's glad to talk to you. I've been aware of your work for a while, but I don't think we've ever actually spoken.
Yeah, it's great talking to you, and I'm also joined here with my co-host Pillator.
It's nice to talk to you, Jay.
Thank you.
You have a book out, Esoteric Hollywood. When was that released?
It's been out for, I think, 3 months now. This is going on the 4th month, so somewhere in December. It's when it was officially released, and so yeah, it's been a fun 4 months, and it's doing well. So yes, that would be correct.
Did you have any personal connections to the industry?
I did not. I didn't know anyone. I'm a peon, a little bitty nothing person in the middle of nowhere. And I was doing a lot of blogging for a long time. And then I did a couple episodes with Sean Stone some years ago, or maybe 2 years ago. And of his Buzzsaw. I did one episode of Buzzsaw, and then the publisher reached out to me because I had, I guess, finally caught his attention or something due to just really having written so many articles. I think there were back then even probably 400 or 500 articles that I'd written. So the main traffic, of course, is just the movie reviews, the film reviews. So they asked if I had any manuscript, which technically I didn't, but I went ahead and said yes because I did have enough material for multiple books, of course, just from the articles. So no, I didn't have any insiders or anything like that.
So with your website at Jay's Analysis, you write movie reviews of different films. How did you get started with that, and what in particular about these films interest you, and is there a certain genre that especially interests you?
Well, I guess like all of us around our age group, I'm in my 30s, so I grew up in the 80s, and I'm assuming you did too, roughly.
Yeah, I'm 31, so I just very kind of tail end of it.
Yeah. I always enjoyed the goofy stuff, the sci-fi stuff, the typical Star Wars, Spielberg type stuff from the 80s, and I always wanted to do movies and theater and stuff like that, but I was kind of a poor redneck boy, so I never had the means to do a lot of that. So here in the dirty South, so what I did was basically when I went to college, I just started blogging, and I did that for about 8 or 10 years, and I just really only knew about writing what I was interested in. You know what I mean? So if you do a philosophy degree, one of the few good things about it from, depending on what your perspective on academics is, I don't have a very high view of state university type academics anymore, but when I was younger and more naive, I was interested in philosophy, and I thought I'd like to be a professor one day and all this kind of stuff. So you get exposed through philosophy to a lot of different disciplines, a lot of different fields, and how they interrelate. And so I was able to, on the one hand, look at the arts and take classes where we studied like Oliver Stone films or literary works by even like, I don't know, Emily Bronte and Wuthering Heights and this kind of stuff, and then compare it to the film presentations, the novels and so forth and so on. So I was already kind of writing about film when I was an undergrad in my 20s, but I just thought that a lot of this material could be put to some other use. You know what I mean? Like, you write, if you do some kind of liberal arts major, you write a lot, in undergrad and grad school. So you think, what is the purpose of all this, write all these papers that you write? I mean, they don't, nothing happens to them, right? So why not turn them into something else and maybe interact with other people? So I just started throwing them up online, and I was already kind of into, back then, maybe the Alex Jones style activism, libertarian type stuff when I was 23, 4, 5. And so I got involved in a little bit of activism back then, and maybe the more Ron Paul libertarian type stuff. And so, a lot of these things, audience-wise, they cross over and they interplay with one another pretty easily. So that's how the audience kind of built up, was from, having interest in other fields besides just movies. It's other, writing about geopolitics, or writing about conspiracies, or the history of espionage, or any of this kind of stuff, right? So that's what it is. It's just you do something long enough, 10 years or so blogging, I guess you'll eventually, unless you're just totally shitty, you're going to have some readers.
And yeah, you analyze films from all those different angles, dealing with philosophy, politics, history, culture. I know some people in dissident politics, they'll sort of have a knee-jerk reaction when they look at any film and say, "Oh, that's completely propaganda." But it's sort of important to understand kind of the nuance, like figuring out what is propaganda and what isn't. Do you think it's kind of a little bit? Do you think some people have a tendency to get too reactive or simplistic in their view of media?
Absolutely. And another thing I think that you eventually grapple with, depending on what you want to do, is that it doesn't really matter what somebody else thinks about what you're doing. I mean, I know that's kind of cliche and simplistic, so I don't mean that in like a 17-year-old libertarian type of perspective. I just mean it in our narco perspective or something. But I just mean it in the sense that the reality of the situation is that there is this gigantic octopus of Hollywood and the entertainment complex that's out there already. So it's there. It's propagandizing people. It's beaming messages into their minds every single day, nonstop. So, bitching about it's not going to do anything. You might as well act on it, and you can act on that in different ways. You know what I mean? Like, I'm sure you act on it in the format that you do, through the means that you do, with your interests, with your taste, with your show. For me, it was a little bit different because I did plan to go the academic route. Like, I wanted to be a professor, and I ended up kind of running into butting heads with department heads and things like that, because I had more like what I guess you could call right-wing type views. Obviously, I don't mean that in the GOP sense, but maybe in the alt-right type sense, I guess you could say. That's, of course, not at all welcomed in the secular university field. So I realized I wasn't really going to be welcomed there, and that was a very tight clique. And so I really just kind of got disgusted with academics, and I'd gotten all the way to the point of writing my thesis. It was 1/3 to half written, and I quit because I was butting heads with a dude who was like a super total globalist, to make a long story short. And there was no way that he was going to allow a person who had the kind of views that I have into normative academia. So I thought, well, I've spent all this time, I've done all this research, not just for school. I mean, I had prior interests in theology and things like that that had nothing to do with academia, but I thought, what am I going to do with all this info? Well, I've been blogging, and here I am working some shit wage slave job for $12 an hour. I might as well take the time that I'm putting into wage slave job, and put it into this website and, see if I can make something of it. So that was another concern of mine was, not just what are the reactionary positions about, how should we view the arts? And I mean, I have concerns about fucking paying the bills. So, so that's part of why I do what I do. It's not just it's a survival thing. It's not like, I mean, I've put 10 years and thousands of dollars into education and into this kind of stuff. So it doesn't really, who cares what,
Were there any particular films that you really enjoyed growing up, but learning about different angles to it and analyzing it kind of ruined the joy of the film?
That's a great question. Yeah, in a way, I guess you could say all of them kind of lose their luster from the reminiscent perspective, because I guess everybody gets older and you kind of see how a lot of this stuff works, especially if you try to do something in media, you kind of see how it's a big scam, it's a big game, and all this kind of stuff. So, yeah, overall, it does lose its luster. I don't know if there's a specific section of films or filmography that I could pick out that have totally lost their luster, but I think when you look at, as you mentioned earlier, the propaganda side of things and how many of how much of film, obviously going back into the 80s as well and prior to that, we're already involved in messages and altering the culture through social engineering and this kind of stuff. Yes, I guess you could say that a lot of just overall, yeah, generally they do, but I can't. I mean, if you were to try to pick out specific ones, I don't know. That's not a very good answer.
Well, that's kind of the success of film. I mean, people have their sort of day-to-day mundane existence, and a film takes you into this kind of a fantasy or dreamlike world, and then using kind of the manipulation of time, music, the aesthetics of the color palettes, powerful mediums, also like the soundtrack, just all those components like transform you to another world. And that's very powerful, but that can be a powerful experience, especially for people growing up. That can also be it can be a way to manipulate people, but it can also be a sense of escapism too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I'll put it this way. As I've gotten older, and when I look back on, like, say, even the stuff that Industrial Light and Magic was doing back in the late 70s or 80s, or like the teams that worked on the effects for, say, Ridley Scott's Blade Runner or something like that, like the artistic work and focus and precision and aesthetic quality that went into those kinds of works, even though, yes, you could argue those were still roughly under the banner of propaganda. When I watch something now, or even if you go back to the Lord of the Rings trilogy with Peter Jackson, I mean, it's just so computer generated that it almost feels like there's like a synthetic video game overlay over all of this stuff that, if you look back to Cecil B. DeMille or something, you see these grand sets that they built where they just built these giant.
Yeah, it seems that era, like the 80s especially, also the 70s, it was like the right balance between technology, where you had enough technology, but there was still the otherworldly kind of dreamlike quality. I think you're absolutely right. That's been lost with this extreme computer effects.
Yeah, even something like the Jim Henson puppetry, there's like a certain...
Oh, like the Labyrinth film, that one.
Right, or Yoda. Like, if you watch Yoda, it's fun, it's silly, it's this little green puppet guy, and then by the time of the re-released prequels of the late 90s and 2000 or 2001 or whatever, it's all just very obvious computer-generated Yoda. It just looks stupid. It looks silly, and I think that the point is that the aesthetic suffers as well. I mean, you know, a big part of this medium is visual presentation, and when everything is just people sitting at, you know, a Mac or a PC in a cubicle, I don't know. It's like, and to me, when you get really deep into the propaganda aspect of it and what the Pentagon has been planning for a long time, you know, video games were actually developed by the Pentagon. They're from the Pentagon.
Yeah.
And their purpose was for military training. And I think it's been released into the private sector ultimately for a reason, for a long-term design. And ultimately, I think aesthetics in the arts suffers. I think it destroys real talent, real abilities, real quality, and it just makes everything into quanta, right? Like everything's little bits, everything's little ones and zeros, and you know, it's all part of the reign of quantity, which ultimately destroys the arts. I think by design too, by the way.
There's sort of this concept of an establishment in Hollywood and anti-establishment filmmakers. There's a number of filmmakers like John Carpenter, Stanley Kubrick, and David Lynch, where you'll see these debates about whether they're anti-establishment filmmakers or not. And there's sort of like speculation whether some films have anti-establishment messages. Right. And debate about what the motive is. Like one film is They Live, and also Kubrick's last film, Eyes Wide Shut.
Absolutely, yeah. That is something that I get asked that question a lot, and of course I don't ever pretend to be like an expert on Kubrick or Lynch as persons. I mean, I find their lives interesting, and certainly you could do whole books on their own careers, but for me, what's more interesting is just film symbolism itself, because I feel like even though one might be tempted, it may sound counterintuitive, that film symbolism is more vague or open to interpretation. I actually feel a little more confident interpreting the symbology than I am trying to interpret somebody's intentions, if that makes sense. So, for example, I had a piece that I did on Twin Peaks. It was a fairly popular essay that within the last couple of years probably had, 70, 80,000 views. And I didn't realize it until about a month ago that Mark Frost, the co-creator with David Lynch, had actually published a book some months ago. So this was far after I'd written my analysis. And I'm not saying my analysis had anything to do with Mark Frost's book at all. I'm just saying that what Mark Frost put out in his book was the back history and the total story of Twin Peaks, which was everything that I talked about, right? So you have all the stuff about Jack Parsons and the Crowley aspects and the demonic aspects of it, and that the aliens are actually demonic. And so all this kind of stuff was in the background, the ritual magic, all this stuff, which I talked about in my analysis. I said, this is what's going on in Twin Peaks. And I'd read many other people's analyses. Nobody else ever really talked about that. So I can kind of brag about that I got that one spot on. And so for me, that's kind of just a vindication of the fact that my approach to interpreting the symbols in Lynch's canon or network of context or lexicon of symbols, I think I'm pretty close to getting it accurate. But that in itself, like you said, I mean, there is this concept of revelation of the method, so it's always hard to know exactly what the director or the artist's intentions might be in terms of whether they're genuinely anti-establishment or not. But who knows? The CIA is very good at co-opting and controlling and running and creating, funding, apparently anti-establishment movements and artists, and have done so for a long time. So, it's just hard to know. Surrealism, is that really anti-establishment? I don't know. It's hard to say. So I just don't really spend a whole lot of time debating that or trying to figure that one out, because I don't know how even if, say, Kubrick, he's working with NASA and he gets some deal to use the Zeiss lens. That was this, special lens that he used for Barry Lyndon or something. Like, does that mean that he's totally under the good thumb of NASA or something? I mean, maybe for 2001 or for Barry Lyndon or something, but I mean, that doesn't mean that Dr. Strangelove is going to portray the Rand Corporation in a good light. So, who knows? Maybe some people vacillate, you know what I mean, over their lifetime. Maybe they feel that they're anti-establishment when they're young, and then maybe by the time they're older and they've got kids, they cave in and they're covertly part of the establishment. I mean, who knows?
Yeah, I do like David Lynch, but I know there's this very cliche thing about him, starting with Eraserhead, that he's known for his very, I guess, surreal horror films, or like, it's this cliche now that exists with the whole, I guess, Lynchian thing. And when people talk David Lynch, it's pretty much a cliche. You see in Twin Peaks with the fish in the percolator and the log lady, these weird, kind of things of that. And then again, it's kind of interesting about Lynch is because there's also films like Dune, where his adaptation of Dune is not totally that expected Eraserhead, but at least it's his own version of how he's seen the Frank Herbert book compared to what could have been of Alexander Horowski's version, which could have had H.R. Giger and, Mick Jagger in it and Salvador Dali, but it never really happened. And
right.
there is a different genius to Lynch, or even his cartoons, I think, is an interesting way. It reminds me of some kind of very strange waspian art avant-garde guy or something. That's what I get from him.
Yeah, I think David Lynch is a mix of influences. I mean, it sounds like you're schooled enough on Lynch that you don't need me to rehearse neo-noir or any of that kind of stuff, or surrealism, or all that stuff's kind of, I guess, obvious.
The neo-noir genre, which kind of the original film noir, but the neo-noir kind of would you say it kind of started in the 80s? Even Blade Runner is kind of neo-noir.
Yes, most people would date it to the late 70s and early 80s,
or
right?
Even I would say any film by Ridley Scott right now, or Nolan's films, there have that neo-noir. There's Inception, and what is it? That film where they're in space. I can't recall it by a name. Interstellar. These. Singles.
Oh, I think you're right. But the thing about the neo-noir genre, it's harder to pull off with this, as we were saying earlier, with this computer-generated technology. Mm-hmm. Something about that specific aesthetic, it does need the natural, very specific lighting.
I think that if you were to, and I forget the terminology I used, but something like neo-noir, surrealist, ritual psychodrama or something like that. Zen Buddhist ritual psychodrama, I think, is what I was describing Lynch's stuff as. And he says oftentimes in interviews that there's this kind of shamanic element to that. He's like the shaman who's trying to speak between two worlds, and between the spiritual realm, the ether, the inner world of the psyche, and the external world. Then the surrealist aspect would, of course, be this notion of there being no clear divide between the waking state and the dream state. And that's definitely everywhere in Lynch. And that interestingly blends well at times with neo-noir, because you see that even in Eyes Wide Shut, where you have obvious surrealist elements, and the Traumnovelle, right? I mean, the dream novel is the original story by Arthur Schnitzler that Kubrick used. So a lot of these, these terms and these ideas, these genres, they blend very well. Lost Highway is obviously totally neo-noir, very dark. But I think that what you're talking about too is there's also this comedian element in Lynch that a lot of people don't recognize. That, like, if you watch Wild at Heart, that's totally a dark comedy, like the entire thing, and a lot of Twin Peaks is totally a dark satirical comedy. that the more that I watch Twin Peaks, actually, the funnier it gets, which is exactly the same with Wild at Heart. It's like like I literally, not many movies do I laugh harder at, upon multiple viewings, but both of those I think are very enjoyable the more that you watch them. Dune is one of my favorite movies, which is funny because David Lynch always talks about how much he hates it. But I wonder if that isn't more so because if I understand the story, was that the De Laurentiis company gave him quite a bit of money to do that, and it didn't make money at all. It didn't do very good. So they were pretty mad for a while. I don't think they allowed him to make any movies with their money for some years, and then I think they asked him to do something else later on the road.
That film is perfect, actually, because for everyone who read Dune has now have a vision of what Dune is, because we usually like to think of the movie that dominates over the text, and Lynch's film of how he saw Dune is now like how everyone traditionally sees it, like this desert world, the spice monster. I can't recall its name. That if you go on the Dunepedia, they're just adaptations of how Lynch saw the things. And same with the Harkonnen family, the big bloated. It's so surreal in the text to imagine a big bloated Russian Soviet Union baron, as Herbert describes, but in Lynch's work, we have the green people and Sting, and it's more easy to obtain. And once again, now if Jodorowsky would have got the attention, that would have been more surreal in art film, and that would have changed the whole perception of how people read or thought about Dune. So movies play an important part of creating a different version of the text and re-looking at things. I mean, it's the same way too, like Eraserhead. A lot of it is scenery from Philadelphia, or some Lynch's version of Philadelphia. I'm actually, from Philadelphia, and I always like to look in that in Eraserhead, actually.
Yeah, there's this other element, too, that he talks about, that a lot of his films he sees as coming out of his psyche. So that's, I think, the ambiguity element of it. I mean, you might be able to get, in my view, I might be able to get 90% of like a Twin Peaks or something, right? But there's always going to kind of be this 10% or maybe 20% where, because it has some kind of inner schematic significance, probably just for David Lynch, that makes it a little ambiguous and difficult at times. And I think that's also part of the appeal, is that seeing it through a glass darkly, I guess you could say, element that still leaves some aspect of it up to mystery is, I think, part of his appeal, in terms of, people are always talking about the Lynchian atmosphere, right? He creates this aesthetic, this atmosphere that not really anybody else seems able to mimic it. Although I do think a lot of people try to do it. I think Nicholas Refn, who I liked, the first one, what was the one with Ryan Gosling? Drive. I thought Drive was pretty good. And then when he did Only God Forgives, it's like he's totally trying to reproduce David Lynch, and it just doesn't even make any sense. I thought that movie was pretty terrible. But, you've got people trying to do this style, but it's just so bizarre and so
Are you talking about it in general, or specifically the aesthetic design?
Well, in Refn's case, I mean specifically the aesthetic design, the imagery, like if you watched Neon Demon, you can tell there's obviously like a lot of David Lynch in that.
It's like
I'll tell you one thing that did successfully translate some of David Lynch, and the creator Nick Pizzolatto of season 1 of True Detective. He says that this is like all just Twin Peaks redone, right? I thought that came out okay, so that he did it successfully.
One of the biggest cliches of David Lynch in animation is probably Salad Fingers, I think by David Firth or something. And Salad Fingers is obviously, I remember those cartoons back then. People say, ooh, how scary it is, or how Lynchian, but it's really not that. It just seems to be just Lynch and taking... you take the parts that becomes the cliche and then exploit it, and then, it becomes that. But at the same time, however, there's another film genre that's very interesting called folk horror, and that's from like the Wicker Man and
Mhm.
I'm thinking the Blood at they're very esoteric BBC films from like the 70s or 80s. Do you know about that genre itself, folk horror? There's a whole book on it actually.
I mean, I've seen the films that you're talking about. Obviously, I've seen Wicker Man, and there are quite a few of those older, like you said, 60s and 70s British films that you can find. I wrote on. I guess it would be included in that genre. The Dennis Wheatley story, Devil Rides Out.
Yes,
that's a great one with Christopher Lee. And what's interesting about that, and the reason I included it in the book, is that both Christopher Lee and Dennis Wheatley had these deep connections to British intelligence, with Wheatley being a MI5 handler. And this debated story, interestingly, about what exactly Christopher Lee did. Was he just a RAF, or was he actually an assassin? Some people think. And then there's actually disputes about whether, I think the Telegraph disputes all this and says, oh, no, he was just, your basic military grunt dude. He didn't really do anything. So, who knows? It's hard to say. But it is interesting that the Wheatley stories are borrowed directly from Crowley. So the Duc de Richelieu character that Christopher Lee plays is I take that back. De Richelieu is not based on Crowley. Like Mokata, the bad guy in Devil Rides Out, is based on Crowley, and Duc de Richelieu is kind of supposed to be the good guy who fights he's kind of the Van Helsing type character. He fights the devil worshippers and the demons and whatnot. But that movie is a very fun British presentation of that whole story. If you haven't seen it,
I really like the aesthetics of folk horror. Like other films are like Witchfinder General, The Blood on Satan's Claw. Pendus Fen, I really like that one. There's a book, it's called Folk Horror Revival. I have that book, and it's a really interesting. They also will go as far to say it's a music genre itself. Such acts like Boards of Canada and Old Brian Eno, and some obscure Dead Can Dance, or and I see the aesthetic. It's a very powerful pagan English niche thing, and it's very hard to describe. But I've been having an interest in that whole folk horror aesthetic.
That's interesting. Yeah, I wasn't aware actually of the musical tie-in, but yes, I am familiar with obviously Brian Eno and Boards of Canada, but no, I didn't really know about that connection.
Because going back, it's to Salad Fingers. Beware This Friendly Stranger by Boards of Canada is played in the background, and I would say Salad Fingers could be some folk horror or Lynchian offshoot.
Right, and just other occult elements that we could tie into this too. I'm not a huge fan of Jodorowsky, by the way, but that's just my personal take on it. So I'm kind of glad he didn't do Dune. I don't know that we would have been able to even make. I don't think his Dune would have even been like watchable. I think
it would have maybe destroyed the whole Dune property.
Right. And I also kind of like it when there's these old movies like Blade Runner or Dune, when there's like 50 versions of them out there. So it's kind of fun to hunt down, the obscure 4-hour version of Dune that I found one time on a torrent one time. And it's like this super long extended version that has all of the storyboards that tell like this whole 20-minute intro. It was really cool, and the artwork is really neat and bizarre too.
That's funny, uncut versions. I like animation. One animation I really like is The Thief and the Cobbler. And the original Thief and the Cobbler was really long, and there's an uncobbled edition which adds all these bizarre what ifs, and it reminds me of that. And it's just an experimental art film, and it's like, what?
There was. When I finally got around to reading Dune, which was probably, 4 years ago, because I always liked the movie, and I was like, well, I should probably read the novel since this is like one of my favorite movies. But Herbert's novel is very influenced by perennialism, which I didn't realize that until I started reading it. And I was like, hey, this is like a bunch of almost kind of René Guénon type type stuff here. This is crazy.
Oh
You
yeah.
know,
And then
I like the Zen Sunnis, right? It's like a Muslim Sunni, but it's Zen. There's that very strange background to that, but
yeah, it's like a mix of, it's like Sufi kind of.
yeah.
And but what the other bizarre elements, and I actually wrote a analysis of the novel right around that time, back when I read it 3 or 4 years ago, which has since then done pretty well. It's a pretty relatively popular analysis. There are also a lot of bizarre conspiracy aspects to it, where you have the notions of large-scale geoengineering, which I don't know what y'all's view of the conspiracy field of chemtrails and geoengineering is, but I tend to think that they're real. And so I was kind of blown away that Herbert's talking about this. I guess he wrote that in the 60s, and he's talking about the possibility of about geoengineering being a real thing, that you could actually alter climates and so forth. Because I read that story as multi-layered, so you can have a geopolitical reading of it that relates to the Middle East and maybe the drug trade or oil or some sort of natural resource type thing. And I also read it in a longer, broader kind of esoteric sense of these perennialist type ideas, as well as these things like the Butlerian jihad, where there's this period where we have to fight against the AI because the AI will inevitably enslave humanity and all this kind of stuff.
I always enjoyed Dune with the board game. I had the novel and the really old 70s board game, and I would play that with my friends. But it's like, it was weird because it's like there's a lot of that on strangeness. Even to David Lynch's film, you try to put the novel, and it still is. It's an imagination thing. It's really hard to put in visions.
You did a review of a Dark City. That's definitely a neo-noir, and it deals with a lot of psychological and occultist themes.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that, because that's actually on the slate to be rewritten. I think I wrote that back in 2009 or so, maybe 10, and it's pretty bad. I'm kind of embarrassed of the writing that I did back then. I thankfully, hopefully, have gotten a lot better since then. But I think that probably overall, the themes that I wrote about, I would probably still agree with today. Sometimes if I rewrite an analysis, I kind of have to change my mind a little bit on what I thought 8 years ago. But I know it's fresh in my mind, because the TV show that we're writing, that Jay Wiedner and I are doing together, excuse me, one of the episodes, I think we're calling it Gnostic Cinema, and it will be on Dark City. I've already Westworld, Dark City, and maybe Truman. No, not Truman Show. I don't know. There's one more movie that we've got in that pile for that show, because they all have that same theme. And so, yeah, the Rufus Sewell character is, of course, this kind of Neo guy, like the Matrix type situation, and he awakens out of the control structure, obviously, if you've seen the film, and then you've got Kiefer Sutherland's playing this total technocrat. And what's very bizarre about the film is that you've got this mad scientist technocrat dude who serves these archons, and you have a lot of borrowing from Metropolis by Fritz Lang, and all these archon controller guys are like underground. They live in these underground bases, and they look like I don't know, they're alien bugs basically, and they use time, Chronos, right, to enslave the population in their fake city. So it's this whole idea of the controlled environment, total surveillance, total panopticism, and then we're not ever really told why. It just kind of happens that Rufus Sewell kind of awakens out of this, and he realizes that through the symbology that he sees, in his experience this spiral, that there's some significance to this spiral. And of course, if you recall, the cop who loses his mind has been drawing spirals everywhere. And so what comes to be the case is that actually he realizes that the loop, the spiral that is ever present, is actually the reality that he's in. So we're kind of at this Nietzschean eternal return idea, which is just a rehashing of the ancient Greek type of idea of, you know, the flatness of time, just being in kind of a never-ending repeat. And that's, I think, by the way, why David Lynch always has the record player. He'll throw this image of the camera focusing on the record player spinning spinning endlessly, and sometimes he'll show the fan spinning endlessly. Why is he doing that? Well, I think that because, you know, from his kind of Zen perspective, it fits in to this same idea of the eternal return. That's why in Lost Highway, the end of the movie begins at the beginning of the movie.
Have you seen Enter the Void by Gaspar Noé, that kind of deals with out-of-body experiences and the psychedelic drug use, but also using that to create this, all kind of as what we were talking about earlier, this alternative universe, and blending the kind of subconscious with the conscious?
Yeah, I did, actually. I had a friend that recommended that to me probably a year and a half, 2 years ago. And it was very, very interesting film, very fascinating. I was kind of entranced by it. It was very unsettling, which obviously I guess that's the point of it. But and I've had bad LSD trips, so it was kind of like, like a little bit of on edge. Not a good, not bringing back good memories here. But yes, I think that film is insightful insofar as, and just my personal view on that, like that's what is happening when you're experiencing that kind of a drug state, altered consciousness, whatever. You are seeing what we might call the spiritual realm or the psychical realm, or whatever terms you want to use. So absolutely, yeah, I think that's probably pretty accurate. I can't remember how it ends. I mean, I remember him. He kind of like floats around the city for a while, and then he sees like a murder. Is it his own? He sees his own body or something, doesn't he? I don't remember how it ends, but
have you?
Yeah, I would say that something like that's probably pretty accurate.
Speaking of the Dark Crystal, have you ever had a chance to read The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe?
I have not, but
it's a very esoteric science fiction series like Dune, and a lot of the themes from Dark Crystal reminds me of the very Wolfian. Basically, the Book of the New Sun is this long piece of this weird apocalyptic culture in the year, beyond, and it's kind of like the Dark Crystal itself. I think in the article you were mentioning that it's not good or evil. It's this weird pantheistic vision of this weird distant future beyond human, in a galaxy far, far away, but not that cheesy and not that. The same way the Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe does the same thing with this unreliable, or this character named Severian, which is, we don't know as a human or an advanced human, but it's all these new concepts it's very, I guess, esoteric, and just like Dune, we don't know how to describe these things. We're just looking. And that's what I got from The Dark Crystal. Even though it was really cheesy and made for like a family movie, I always thought it was Jim Henson trying to be dead serious and grimdark, and then it kind of everyone laughs at it and says it's,
Yeah, right. It's like, right.
Yeah. But it's cool. And if you get over that, it's like I see what he's doing. He's like, at least the Book of the New Sun it's very written like a biblical text. You want to believe this is an English translation of a foreign tongue from a far out world of when humans are evolved in these things. But it's like with Dark Crystal, at least everything's puppet. There's no people in it, and it's this it's very esoteric too, where the planets aligned, and every something years, there's different turns of history. You have to think about that.
Yeah, there's like these aeons, and I think it's very Kabbalistic. And if I recall, the mystics are all drawing spirals. That's their kind of symbol. And then the Skeksis, interestingly, who, by the way, are sapping the life out of the Gelfling children. So they actually kind of seem to be like the elite of our planet, who will sap the life essence out of children as part of their ritual process, I believe. So I think, yeah, Henson's doing the same thing. He's telling us truths on multiple levels. But yeah, I tend to think that's a pretty Kabbalistic type of film. And then you start to realize that, Henson doesn't have any problem doing that. I mean, Labyrinth is very, very Kabbalistic as well.
Oh yeah, you did review Jim Henson's Labyrinth, starring David Bowie and
Right.
Jennifer Connelly, and it's interesting with the whole theme of the Labyrinth itself. I mean, there's a lot to say about the film, but it really there's a theme in ancient mythology in ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome. There's also the kind of a Jungian take on the labyrinth and the human unconscious psyche.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's exactly the reading that I took from it. And, like you said with Dark Crystal, going with this kind of Gnostic, Kabbalistic perspective. And I think the symbology of the artwork that Henson used for Dark Crystal is obviously Kabbalistic, like it's straight out of the kind of sigils and whatnot that Kabbalistic imagery would use. And that's not to say that Henson's like being, quote, Jewish per se, because as I'm sure we all know, Freemasonry and many other even pagan groups have utilized the structures, if you will, of Kabbalah with the tree and the Sephirot and all that kind of stuff. But that's all directly there in the symbology in Dark Crystal. So I don't think it's a leap to read the Labyrinth in that way as well, because the entire journey is Sarah stepping into her own subconscious. And then, interestingly, when I recently, I think last week or this week, a few days ago, I did a big analysis of Time Bandits, and I noticed it's the exact same thing. So the little boy, Kevin, in Terry Gilliam's Time Bandits, everything that's in his room, all these toys, all these pictures and paintings that he's done, they make up the architecture of his subconscious. And so when he falls asleep and goes into that inner world and experiences everything that we're seeing in the film, his time traveling and going back and meeting Sean Connery as Agamemnon, and when he goes and he meets Napoleon, right, with Ian Holm playing Napoleon, all this kind of stuff, and then he goes and he meets evil himself, Lucifer, Satan, whatever. This is all within the structure, the fabric of his inner world is everything that was in his bedroom. And then even his parents, right, show up as these minions of the devil. That's the exact same thing in Labyrinth, because when Sarah goes to sleep, or when she steps into her fantasy world, it's her inner subconscious. And so I think both of those films will use the M.C. Escher drawings and labyrinth mazes type stuff to signify the subconscious. And as I said in different articles, that's always been kind of a symbolic image that's used for the subconscious. The Egyptians used labyrinths and mazes, if I recall, for that.
Didn't you say
medieval Europe
they used the labyrinth for their idea of the afterlife?
I think I did say that. I know that comes up in my analysis of The Shining, because the labyrinth in The Shining, I did a whole bunch of research and tried to connect that to different mythologies about labyrinths, because you have in medieval Europe, you have this notion of this life being the labyrinth, and that's why they would draw labyrinth images, on the base of the floor of many cathedrals. You'll have this labyrinth that you got to kind of solve, and that was supposed to be emblematic of trying to teach, I guess, the peasantry that this life is full of dead ends and wrong turns, and you need to solve it, like I guess Theseus solved the labyrinth or something. And then you notice, I've written several analyses of Christopher Nolan films, and Jonathan Nolan, I guess, too, by extension. You start to notice, they have a big fascination with labyrinths too, hence Inception. And you start to see this repeating, right? And Interstellar, interestingly, is a kind of a big time labyrinth. It's labyrinth. A labyrinth that takes place through the span of time rather than through distance, and so or space. And that's ultimately what I argued Kubrick's film is about, right? Is about the Shining. That is about these different cultures that do have this this conception of the afterlife actually being a kind of maze, and I mean, we could go in all kinds of directions with that. So I'm not sure what to say on that, but absolutely.
I don't know if you've reviewed Hellraiser, but in Hellraiser 2, they use the labyrinth to symbolize like the dark, kind of other dimension, if you could say it's a hell.
Yeah. I have seen that, and in fact, I watched it fairly recently. And actually, there's a whole bunch of movies that present there's a lot of symbology that can be used for the subconscious. Basements. Now this is going to sound silly, but I promise you, if you watch it, have you ever seen the '80s movie House or House 2?
Yes, I remember
that. Yeah, the basement is explicitly referenced and explained to be a subconscious, and then you'll start to notice that a lot of times they do this in films where they're not just going down to the basement for no reason. There's actually like this is where the trauma happened, and it's it's been stored in this person's psyche deep down.
Yeah, I mean, I saw this kind of it's like a teen horror film called The Hole, which came out in 2009.
I remember The Hole, yeah.
Oh yeah, but the whole premise is that they discover this basement, and you think that the hole was like the entrance to hell, but then they find out at the end that the hole represents like their subconscious, and when the boy finally goes down into the hole, he solves his problems with his dad, and then he fixes everything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly. I think it's an archetypal symbol. I think Carl Jung would agree with us here that's why that's going on. I was just thinking of another movie that I watched. Well, for example, in Time Bandits, when the kid and the little people, when they get to the edge of reality, so they go back in time to the time of the golden age of the giants and the titans and so forth, and they reach this barrier that they call the barrier of invisibility or something like that. When they break through that, there's this giant chasm and labyrinth before you get to darkness's lair. So there's like the abyss. And I think that there is I can't really explain it. I don't know how, but there's some kind of connection between our deepest, darkest subconscious and what we might call the abyss. So esoteric writers or mystics or different people that at times might be trying to describe their encounter with this kind of stuff. If the spiritual journey that they're describing, or drug-induced journey that they're describing, if it's happening on a spiritual inner journey, I would say that this is what they're describing. They're describing an actual spiritual reality that I think even ultimately the Bible even talks about this, because the Bible will talk about the abyss, it'll talk about the void, and it'll even Isaiah even talks about Tiamat, which is kind of this weird nether world of just crazy shit kind of rising up out of this abyss or something. I don't know, like a Cthulhu type thing or something.
So not really hell, but kind of an in-between void.
Yes, a void is the good way to put it. Right, exactly.
I brought up the film Hellraiser, and with like the puzzle box, what do you see as the esoteric symbolism behind the significance of the puzzle box in Hellraiser?
If I recall, isn't it a cube?
Yeah, it's a cube in a puzzle box.
Yeah, I would say that's another one of those kind of archetypal, religious and mystic type symbols of. I mean, you probably hear this a lot bantered around in conspiracy circles, but it's actually kind of true. I mean, there is a cubic association with Saturn and with time and space, because in our dimension you can only go in 6 directions. You can only go left, right, up, down, backwards, and forwards. So that's, in like Pythagorean geometry or Euclidean geometry, that's it. Like, you can't go. That's the only ways that you can ever go in this, within time and space, and that makes a cube. And so, because of the long time association of Saturn, Chronos, with time, the symbology or the symbol that has always been used for Saturn is time. And because Saturn devours his children, you always hear this mythology, that's because time kills everything. Right. So if we're born into time, we're eventually killed by time. So Kronos eats his children. So the cube then is oftentimes associated with death, because, right, Saturn is also the old Grim Reaper dude with the Sith, right? And so death is going to come for you, and that's what Pinhead does. He comes for you with his Saturn Kronos cube. But again, I remember watching. So in the first one, it's that house, right, where the chick is trying to rebuild her boyfriend. Isn't that what's going on? And he's kind of coming back to.
She's bringing him back to life from the dead.
Yeah, right.
By feeding him humans.
And then I remember in 2, there is the maze and there's the cube, but I can't remember what else is it. Is that the one that has the dude that throws CDs, like compact discs that cut you in half?
Oh yeah, I think so. We had Chatter, the actor who plays Chatterer, on the show.
Nicholas Vince. Yep.
Yeah.
I wonder if is there like a dude that shoots laser discs? If this was.
That was the one where she enters the maze and they go into the labyrinth. And
that might be the third one. I kind of get those mixed up, but
we were reviewing this film on the show called The Babysitter with Alicia Silverstone. I don't know if you've seen it, but it deals with the whole theme of fantasy and living in a kind of a fantasy world. Have you seen that film?
I saw it probably when I was like an 8th grader and was watching it when I shouldn't have, on some kind of fuzzy HBO that didn't come in or something, and I thought maybe I'd get to see her breasts or something.
No, it's a big it's a big build-up. You just see these long scenes of Alicia Silverstone lying in the bathtub with her cheeky smile and the bubbles covering her up.
Right, I remember the movie. I know what you're talking about, and I remember Poison Ivy too. And I thought you were joking when you mentioned those, but I looked at your wall and I was like, oh, actually, he has reviewed these. I thought you were kidding, but no, it probably would be interesting to look at those. I haven't even thought about those, since 8th grade. You know what I mean? Since you mentioned them.
Pilater, you've seen that film?
Yeah, I've seen. I'm just thinking of other films I remember growing up with and enjoying. I'm thinking one of my favorite films I remember was the Leon the Professional with Jean Reno, Natalie Portman, and Gary Oldman. I really enjoyed that film by Luc Besson. Some of the other Luc Besson films are very interesting studies.
Pilater, you devoted that story in your book to that.
What's that?
You devoted a short story to that film.
Hold on, remind me. The Professional,
Is it
right?
Nana's story?
No, that was actually Nana. That's an anime. Well, no. Oh yeah, yeah. Natalie Portman. I know what you're talking about. Yeah,
you're talking about The Professional.
Yeah. There, Natalie Portman played as Matilda, and I referenced a character in that story. But yeah, there's a lot of things in there from animes to films. But nice you picked that up. I completely was out of my head on that. That just shows you how irrationally I like that film.
Yeah, Luc Besson is hit and miss. I think he's got some really stinkers that he's made, and then he's got
his
some
family films. His family.
Well, I think I can't decide if I like The Messenger. I mean, sometimes I think it's terrible. I think that La Femme Nikita is okay. It's kind of weird. It's not something that I want to watch more than once. Fifth Element is fun and ridiculous. but I think he's the new movie that he's got coming out looks like a totally updated. It looks just like a new version of The Fifth Element. And then Lucy, I thought was terrible. I read a whole scathing, making fun of it review when that came out. I thought it was really dumb. But then there's one more I'm forgetting that I do like. There's another Besson film. Anyway, I'm not a huge fan of Luc Besson. He's okay.
Yeah, basically his first French films were his authentic, and then somewhere starting with The Fifth Element, it just went downhill the past 20 years.
Downhill.
You
Totally.
did review the film They Live. That's a film that's sort of put out there as like a dissonant film where he kind of he puts on the glasses and he sees the world for what it is. And I guess it's also been kind of described as like a critique against consumerism. But
Right.
A lot of people kind of speculate about John Carpenter and what his motives are. Are you a big fan of his work?
I am, absolutely. I grew up watching Big Trouble in Little China, interestingly. I'm not really sure why. It's kind of like if you were a kid in the 80s, and my dad was a big cheapo, so he wouldn't let us get a VHS for a long time, so we had a Betamax for as long as you could literally have a Betamax. And so when we would go to rent movies, it was very limited. They would have like these little green tags next to the ones that the movie rental place in the 80s still had for Betamax. And then so like most of the movies had the red tags. So there was only a handful of beta versions. And so we would rent the same ones over and over because I didn't have any options. And so I watched Big Trouble in Little China, I don't know how many times as a kid. I can quote it. And then as I got older, I thought, when I was in high school, I've always liked movies, but you go through phases, you know what I mean? When I was at 18, 19, or 20 or whatever, it was all Tarantino because that was what was cool, right? Like everybody loved Quentin Tarantino. That was the coolest thing. Maybe Martin Scorsese movies, Goodfellas, that kind of stuff. And then as you get older, you branch out and you appreciate more things. And, it wasn't until much older that I really enjoyed most of John Carpenter's canon, actually. My plan is to go through the entire Carpenter canon, just like I'm going to eventually do the entire Lynch canon and some others. But I do think that the intention by John Carpenter is to literally... I do think he probably is anti-establishment. I think you could definitely argue that pretty strongly.
With John Carpenter, you're saying indefinitely, as with Lynch, you're not sure.
Well, I'd hope to think Lynch is, and I mean, he's made some statements that seem pretty, fuck Hollywood.
Politically, he's interesting politically because originally he described himself as a libertarian. Then he was involved with this third party called the Natural Law Party. Mm-hmm. And then I think he backed Bernie Sanders. And then when it came down to kind of like Trump and Hillary, he pretty much just was silent.
Yeah, well, interestingly, Lynch is... he was on Alex Jones, interestingly, and was talking about 9/11 Truth a long time ago. So... now, what I'm totally a 9/11 truther. I've been for a long time. So to me, that suggests that he's on the up and up. I mean, he obviously knows what's going on, depending on what your view of 9/11 is. But I would suggest I don't know, but I would just like to hope that he doesn't strike me as the kind of person who wants to go along to get along. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's definitely true. His films are very... putting aside politics, just looking at it for the arts, he's someone who really wants to kind of stand out and create a unique style, a genre, as opposed to just making movies for the masses and just trying to sell as many films as possible.
Have you?
And that's precisely... if you watch I remember when Lost Highway came out, a lot of people were saying this is him basically throwing up a middle finger to Hollywood. And if you watch Lost Highway, there's no way that kind of a movie would ever be in theaters. I'm kind of amazed rewatching Twin Peaks recently, and I'm just thinking, how in the world was this ever on network TV? This is so bizarre. Like, how was there ever a nationwide release of something like Lost Highway? There would never be a movie like that in theaters nowadays.
Have you ever seen a horror film called Begotten?
I have not. I like a lot of horror movies, but you'll probably put me to shame.
No, it's from 1990.
Like
It's by E. Elijah Smearhedge. He also directed, I think it was Shadow of the Vampire. That was the 2000 film, but it might be interested in the Lynch thing. It's an experimental film. It's black and white, and people said it made the trailer said it makes Eraserhead a walk in the park. Like, it was on the verge of being like, this is brutal. And Begotten has a cult following, and there's something in the aesthetic. When I saw it, I basically was scarred at such a young age, Begotten. And yet the movie itself is just silence. It's a silent film, just disgusting noise, and supposedly it's supposed to be retelling Genesis, right? It's just an art film, an avant-garde art film. Yet at the same time, it has the aesthetics of horror, and I always think this is like a true horror film, and as relating it back to Salad Fingers or the classical Lynch cliche horror, it gets you by the aesthetic, and there's something esoteric behind that. I thought if you know about it, it's something to look into, though.
What do you think of Inland Empire?
I remember seeing. I don't know what to think about Inland Empire. I kind of didn't really have a thought about it at first, and I'm still kind of. I don't know, the way I think about films is I'll see them, and then it's like I'll like have I don't know if I have a thought about Inland. I just have to see it again. It's been some time. The last time I think I saw it was like 16, actually.
We're at the end of the show. Before I wrap things up, Jay, do you want to plug your upcoming TV project?
Sure. First, I want to say that if you want to get the book, please go to Jay's Analysis, and I have a tab up at the top where you can get it directly from me signed, and that's always better for the author as opposed to Amazon. Amazon kind of undercuts authors, and we don't do very good through that. So if you would like to get the book, please get it from me. It's 363 pages. It's 404 footnotes, and it's about 50 or 60 sidebars, which is just extra explanatory information. And it's a good book. It's my freshman outing. I'm pleased with it, and it's done very well. I think I have, across markets, I have 60 5-star reviews so far. So if you like film and you like this kind of weird stuff, you will enjoy it. There's a Lynch section, there's a Hitchcock section, Spielberg section, Kubrick section, and much more 70s and 80s stuff. So please support me through the book. And I also do talks and lectures and interviews as well at my website that you can subscribe to. And then the TV project will be with me and Jay Wiedner, who has done the Kubrick documentaries of some note. And we will be presenting 17 30-minute television episodes with a set and all that will analyze different themes in every episode. So like the first episode, I think, is Alien. Believe it or not, we're going to try to, it's either Alien or Ridley Scott. I can't remember off the top of my head, but so we're going to do the entire Alien series in a 30-minute show with clips, and then, kind of like Roger Ebert and Siskel and Ebert style, but like esoteric Siskel and Ebert basically is what it's going to be. So that will be in the upcoming months. It'll be aired on Gaia, which is streaming, and then also on some cable and satellite networks, which I don't really know all the details of all that, but if you follow Jay's Analysis, I'll update everybody on that.
Jay Dyer, it's been an excellent show. We've covered a lot of really interesting, fascinating topics. Thanks for being on.
Thank you, Robert, and Pill Eater. I've had a great conversation. It's always great when I do these kind of talks with people that like movies, and I always learn from other people because there's, movies are a vast topic. So you guys have taught me as well.
Awesome.